Lecture number 1, Some American History and the Constitutional Convention. Before considering specific aspects of the Constitution, perhaps we should establish its underlying philosophical base by reviewing a little American history and some basic principles. That's what the first few lectures will do. Before the American Revolution, the colonists felt they had too little say in the laws that governed them, and that the British Crown had too much control over them, for the colonists had no formal representation in Parliament. They felt that the Crown was trying to excessively micromanage what was going on in the colonies. For example, the Proclamation of October 7, 1763, prohibited the colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. Because British currency was in short supply in the American colonies, the colonists often used coins of the Spanish dollar to facilitate commerce. When the combination of those currencies was inadequate to transact business in the colonies created their own paper money called colonial scrip, which was denominated in pounds, shillings, and pence. Under the Currency Acts, the colonists were forbidden to print their own currency at all. All debts, public and private, could only be paid with proper English money. That caused an immediate shortage of currency in the colonies, which caused an economic depression. According to Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, quote, "In 1 year, the economic conditions were so reversed that the era of prosperity ended, and a depression set in to the extent that the streets of the colonies were filled with unemployed. The colonies would gladly have borne little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. The inability of the colonists to get power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of George III and the international bankers was the prime reason for the Revolutionary War." End quote. Under the concept of British mercantilism, we could only send raw materials as opposed to finished goods manufactured here to England. For example, cotton could not be manufactured into finished goods here and sold to England. Rather, the raw cotton first had to be shipped to England, manufactured into finished goods over there, and then shipped back to the colonies to be sold here. Moreover, we could only sell things to England and not to other nations. We were taxed through various means like the Sugar Act of 1764, which taxed molasses imported from other nations other than England into the colonies. In response, the colonists cried, quote, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," end quote. The Quartering Act of 1765 required the colonists to provide quarters, fuel, candles, cider or beer, and transportation for British troops stationed here. The Stamp Act of 1765 required the colonists to buy tax stamps and place them on newspapers, playing cards, diplomas, and various legal documents. Due to the angry protests it spawned in the colonies, it was repealed the next year. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed duties or taxes on the importation into the colonies of tea, paper, lead, and paint. The colonists protested by refusing to buy British goods. The acts were repealed in 1770 except with respect to tea. That prompted the most famous protest taught to us in our American history classes, the Boston Tea Party. After the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed a series of bills known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. They closed the Boston Harbor, changed the government of Massachusetts Bay Colony, changed the judicial system in that colony, and allowed the quartering of troops in private homes without paying compensation. When I did some research several years ago in the Library of Congress, I discovered a very interesting set of books called the American Archives. Sometime in the 1830s, Congress decided to try to preserve the documentary history of the country while it still existed. It commissioned the research and printing of a series of books by that title, which contained a very wide variety of writings that shed light upon the creation of our country. I perused the part covering the debate in Parliament over the passage of those Intolerable Acts and found some very interesting quotes. Lord North was the leading proponent of these acts in Parliament on behalf of the King. In arguing his case for a stronger exercise of authority over the colonies in response to the Tea Party, he said, quote, "If we exert ourselves now with firmness and intrepidity, it is more likely the colonists will submit to our authority," end quote. Mr. Montague agreed and maintained that the disorders in America resulted from England being too lenient, and that the situation called for the exercise of power. Mr. Jenkins observed that if England did not take a strong position and make an example out of the Bostonians, they will, quote, "become a precedent to the rest of the colonies," end quote. As part of a minority in Parliament opposed to those bills, Mr. Byng predicted that the bills would only produce more of the very conduct by the Americans that Lord North and his friends detested and wished to control. Captain Phipps added, quote, "Let America alone, and it will return itself to obedience," end quote. Lord G. Cavendish said, quote, "That country which is kept by power is in danger of being lost every day," end quote. And Edmund Burke observed, quote, "The spirit of English legislation must execute itself, or no power under heaven will be able to effect it," end quote. In other words, the law must be moral enough and respectable enough that people in general can see on their own the wisdom of self-compliance and do so voluntarily without the necessity of external force. Ultimately, the latter group proved to be the better prophets. The intolerable acts tended to unite the colonies against the crown, and public sentiment eventually turned revolutionary. When they finally decided to revolt from the mother country, the colonists organized under a very weak type of central government called the Articles of Confederation. Under this arrangement, the federal government had little power to force the states to do anything. For example, near the end of the war, when the federal government would order certain amounts of manpower and financing from the various states, the states started to refuse those orders. The states claimed they had already committed more than their fair share of money and blood to the war effort, and under the Articles of Confederation there wasn't much the federal government could do about it. So we went from a situation of very little colonial rights and almost ultimate central authority in King George III before the Revolution, to almost ultimate states' rights during and after the Revolution under the Articles of Confederation. After winning the Revolutionary War, however, the 13 states started exercising their state sovereignty in somewhat extreme ways. They were very uncooperative with one another and started acting almost like independent countries. They had their own money systems, and at the behest of the more numerous debtor class against the interest of their creditors, many states overprinted their paper money, making it worth less and less over time, which caused inflation. Consider the situation of a debtor farmer in an easy money regime. When he borrowed money in year one and bought his farm with the proceeds, he took on the obligation to pay back, over several years, the principal of the loan along with a certain amount of interest. As the printed money supply in the state expanded at a much faster rate than the growth of the economy in that state, represented by the amount of goods and services produced there, people started demanding higher prices for the things they sold to compensate for the perceived excess of paper money in circulation. So over the years, the farmer debtor would raise the prices he charged when he sold what he produced on his farm, and would use the more easily obtained, devalued money to repay his creditors in future years. From the creditor's perspective, considering the ever-declining worth of that money over time, he may very well end up losing economic value on net from his lendings. It would all depend on the rate of interest he originally charged on the loan. Assuming the entire debt was actually repaid by the debtor, if the rate of interest exceeded the rate of inflation, the creditor came out ahead in real economic terms. But if the rate of inflation caused by the easy paper money policy exceeded the rate of interest charged for the loan, he came out behind in real economic terms. By the way, this could be used to illustrate the dynamic we often see today where politicians in government create a problem through the passage of some law, blame the problem on somebody else, and then create the political impression that they are only the good guys who are boldly riding to the rescue of the little guy against the rapacious capitalists. And how do they supposedly ride to their aid? By passing even more forceful and intrusive laws at the expense of individual liberty, in an attempt to address the problem they themselves created. But then that legal response spawns even more problems, which allows the political merry-go-round to keep turning and turning to the point where we are drowning in law. In other words, when the state government unreasonably expanded its paper money supply, thereby devaluing its money, in response, creditors would naturally raise the rate of interest they demanded to entice them to lend out their money in future loans, so that they could be reasonably assured of making a real economic return in lending out their money, after all the smoke eventually clears. And when they raised their interest rates in anticipation of government-created inflation, they could be easily cast as the greedy bad guy by the politicians, as they propose to do things like pass usury laws imposing caps on the amount of interest that can be charged on loans. This will look very good to the little and good guy debtors, who are much more numerous than the supposed bad guy lenders, who don't represent as many votes. Now let's get back to our very short historical account of the conditions existing in the country before adoption of the U.S. Constitution, which actually encouraged its creation. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 was an attempt by insurrectionists to force an easy paper money regime in Massachusetts like I discussed a few moments ago. When the state leaders were convinced that an easy paper money policy was generally bad for the economy and refused to promote it, the debtors in the eastern part of the state revolted and through force of arms closed down the court system in their part of the state in an attempt to stop the judicial foreclosure process regarding delinquent debtors. At the time, debtors could also be imprisoned for defaults in the repayment of their debts. The rebellion had to be forcefully subdued. It ended on February 2, 1787, which was after the Annapolis Convention but before the Constitutional Convention. The Annapolis Convention was convened to amend the Articles of Confederation but ended in failure. To amend those articles required unanimous consent by all 13 states, but only 5 states even attended. The Annapolis Convention ended with a plea by those in attendance for another convention to be called to achieve their purpose, which was to more effectively deal with the various squabbles that were breaking out between the states over various issues that I will discuss more fully in a moment. Anyway, as word spread around the country about Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, it tended to encourage the states to send delegates to the follow-up convention in Philadelphia, known as the Constitutional Convention, in May of 1787. This culminated in the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, which didn't just amend the Articles of Confederation, but effectively terminated them in their entirety. This discussion also sheds some light on a term in the Constitution that is not well understood by most people. The term bills of credit refers to paper money. In Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, the states are specifically prohibited from issuing bills of credit or paper money. Hopefully you now understand why this prohibition appears there. In this regard, it's also interesting to note what happened during the Constitutional Convention on August 16, 1787, according to James Madison's personal journal. If one looks at the U.S. Constitution, one will see that among the powers specifically delegated to the federal Congress in Article 1, Section 8, is the power to, quote, coin money, end quote. According to Madison, on the foregoing date, it was proposed that the delegation of authority to the federal Congress regarding money include the power to issue bills of credit, but that proposal was voted down by the delegates. Now let's consider some other irritants that were building up between the various states under the Articles of Confederation. Border fights erupted over contested territory. For example, New York, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts all claimed the territory which now comprises the state of Vermont. George Washington had to personally intervene to avert war concerning the matter. Maryland claimed ownership to the far bank of the Potomac River and charged all Virginian traffic a fee to use the river. In response, Virginia charged all Maryland traffic a fee to use the portion of the Chesapeake Bay which it controlled further down the river. Connecticut was the major supplier of firewood for New York, and New Jersey was New York's major supplier of food. When New York levied a tax on firewood and food, Connecticut viewed that as New York imposing a tax on the people of Connecticut. In response, it cut off all trade with New York. In similar fashion, New Jersey attempted to get even by imposing a property tax on the lighthouse at Sandy Hook, which was on the New Jersey side of the New York harbor. The various states imposed tariffs whenever commodities would pass through them to some other state. These were attempts by the various states to push the burden of taxation onto the shoulders of out-of-staters who would doubtless be angry over those taxes but couldn't vote within the various states that imposed them. Somewhere I read that New York even imposed a tariff or tax on anything being shipped out of the country from its ports. All of this conduct cumulatively created artificial barriers to free trade among the states. The federal government could not effectively make any treaties with foreign countries since the states had the power to circumvent them at every turn. Consequently, foreign powers saw no point in trying to negotiate with an entity which had no effective power to bind its constituent parts. People could see that they would have to change things, or we would just break up into 13 different fully independent countries and, in effect, construct a miniature Europe over here with all of its long tradition of uncooperation, political infighting, and wars. Consequently, the Constitutional Convention was convened in Philadelphia to consider how to strengthen the federal government so that we could seriously call ourselves one unified country without laughing in the next breath. As the people considered the prospect of changing the federal government, they knew they had to give it more central power, but their principal fear was going too far and creating too strong of a central government. People generally prized the notion of individual state sovereignty and didn't want to give up too much of it. They wanted to find a happy medium between the two extremes which they had recently experienced. In other words, too strong of a central government under the British Crown and too weak of a central government under the Articles of Confederation. As the Constitutional Convention proceeded and the new Constitution was debated, it became clear that the new federal government was viewed by most as a government of limited and specifically delegated powers. Whatever power it had came from below by specific delegation and common consent, and it held no powers by itself absent that bottom-up delegation. This is a most fundamental constitutional principle which, as we will see later, is totally lost on most Americans today because of 1. The way they have been taught their American history, and 2. What the U.S. Supreme Court has allowed the federal government to get away with over the past 80 years or so. To illustrate this principle, consider the following examples of sentiment. About 3 months into the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, George Mason rose to his feet and proposed that the new Constitution contain certain delineations of rights, like freedom of speech, to protect the people from a potentially threatening federal government. If I might paraphrase, the basic upshot of the response was effectively this: "Don't worry, Mr. Mason. We didn't delegate any power to the federal government to regulate speech, so it would be superfluous to even talk about it in the text of the Constitution. By starting from the proposition that the federal government is only a government of limited and specifically delegated powers, as a document, the Constitution could be much shorter than it otherwise would have to be. After all, it's much easier to enumerate what it can and should do than to try to list everything it can't or shouldn't do. Therefore, silence in the document implies lack of federal authority, not the possession of it." Anyway, the majority accepted that argument, and Mason's proposal failed. But when the Constitution was sent to the states for adoption without a Bill of Rights attached, many people agreed with Mason and criticized this as a major deficiency. After all, they had just revolted from an overly powerful and tyrannical central authority and knew, as Lord Acton would later express, that, quote, "all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely," end quote. In response to such criticisms, Alexander Hamilton in Federalist No. 84 echoed the sentiments of Mason's opponents by saying, quote, "For why declare that things should not be done which there is no power to do? Why, for instance, should it be said that liberty of the press should not be restrained when no power is given by which restrictions may be imposed?" End quote. Hamilton wanted to make sure that no faulty implications were drawn regarding the notion of the federal government having only limited delegated powers. He worried about the implications of total silence regarding a particular governmental power. On the one hand, he argued in several of the Federalist Papers that unless a particular power were specifically delegated in a positive way to the federal government, it did not reside with the federal government. But on the other hand, later on, some people with an expansionist federal mindset could argue that unless that particular power were specifically denied to the federal government, it held that power by implication. Hamilton worried that attaching a Bill of Rights with specific prohibitions would bolster the later erroneous argument made by those desirous of expanding federal authority. Nevertheless, many were not persuaded by his argument and did not want to take any chances that this new federal government would trample on their rights. Consequently, several states voted to adopt the new Constitution, but only after getting assurances that after adoption, the Federalists would support amending the Constitution with a Bill of Rights. Hence, the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were added to it 4 years later. It is interesting to note that Alexander Hamilton is often pointed to as one who believed in very expansive and open-ended federal powers. I have not studied him very closely to see what he said in his later years, but I defy you to support that proposition from what he wrote in the Federalist Papers, which was the intellectual sales pitch used to effectively persuade people to jettison the Articles of Confederation and adopt the Constitution as its replacement. I presume that he was an honest man and take him at his word in those essays contained within the Federalist Papers which are ascribed to him, and that he was not just making some sort of insincere or dishonest sales pitch for adoption. As an example of how Americans don't seem to understand these basic concepts because of the way we were taught our American history, one evening my family was having a discussion around the dinner table about something the federal government was doing, but really had no authority to do. My son-in-law asked, "Where in the Constitution does it say the federal government can't do that?" The implication of his question was that unless it was specifically prohibited from doing something, it could do whatever it wanted. This is the exact opposite of how the founders intended the Constitution to be interpreted. After about 4 months of debate and drafting, the final version of the Constitution was completed. It was then transmitted to the National Congress and the states for adoption. Under the signature of George Washington, a letter of transmittal accompanied the document. It said, in part, quote, Sir, we have now the honor to submit to the consideration of the United States in Congress assembled that Constitution which has appeared to us the most advisable. Individuals entering into society must give up a share of liberty to preserve the rest. The magnitude of the sacrifice must depend as well on situation and circumstance as on the object to be obtained. It is at all times difficult to draw with precision the line between those rights which must be surrendered and those which may be reserved. And on the present occasion this difficulty was increased by a difference among the several states as to their situation, extent, habits, and particular interest. In all our deliberations on this subject, we kept steadily in view that which appears to us the greatest interest of every true American, the consolidation of our Union, in which is involved our prosperity, felicity, safety, perhaps our national existence. This important consideration, seriously and deeply impressed on our minds, led each state in the convention to be less rigid on points of inferior magnitude than might have been otherwise expected, and thus the Constitution which we now present is the result of a spirit of amity and of that mutual deference and concession which the peculiarity of our political situation rendered indispensable." End quote. Some people today refuse to consider the U.S. Constitution as anything worthy of respect or preservation since it allowed slavery. During the convention, the divisive issue of slavery was debated. Many wanted to abolish the practice, but the southern states refused to go along with anything that would do that. Since that issue threatened the goal of national unity, which Washington observed to be our primary goal, it would have to wait for another day before it could be finally resolved. In order to secure the necessary Southern votes, the Constitution specifically prohibited any amendment until 1808 of its sections which effectively protected the institution of slavery. In effect, the drafters promised the South 20 years of a hands-off policy concerning slavery. The implication of this was that after 20 years, the issue would finally be addressed at the national level. It wasn't until the Civil War that the issue would finally be resolved, but everyone was on notice from the outset that the status quo regarding that issue was only temporary. Harry V. Jaffa cautions us not to think of slavery as a, quote, constitutional principle, end quote, but rather a, quote, constitutional compromise, end quote, dictated by the demands of prudence. It is easy for us to morally criticize our history of slavery, but just try to imagine what would have happened had those opposed to slavery imprudently taken an unyielding and categorically absolute moral stance on that issue and demanded that the Constitution then and there abolish the practice. We might very well have split up into two different countries, a United States of North America and a United States of Southern America, both of which be north and east of modern-day Florida. Being so close in time to the bloody American Revolutionary War, if the southern states were to have broken off at that point, it is doubtful that the northern states would have had any will to try to forcefully do anything about it. After several decades passed in such a separated condition, it's also doubtful the northern nation would have ever attacked the southern nation for the purpose of forcing it to free its slaves. And who knows, like other countries around the world today, like Mali, perhaps the southern nation would still practice slavery even today. Moreover, such a separation probably would have ignited a very bloody and competitive quest for empire in this hemisphere, with both countries aggressively claiming western lands as fast as they could before the other did. In the process, skirmishes would likely have flared up between the competing sides, which would have spawned growing animosities between them and perhaps even leading to open war. After all, this same thing happened even after we adopted the Constitution and formed up as a single nation. As territories vied for statehood, the South tried to get them to come in as fellow slave states, while the North tried to get them to come in as fellow free states. If the South could manage to thwart any attempt by the North to multiply the number of free states to the point where they could get 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states to vote for a constitutional amendment to terminate slavery, the South could maintain the institution of slavery indefinitely. Part of the reason the Mormons were treated so poorly in Missouri was because Missouri had already entered the Union as a slave state, and people didn't like the fact that the Mormons were anti-slavery and their numbers were growing so fast. Conceivably, with enough anti-slavery people relocating to Missouri, its state constitution might someday be amended to prohibit slavery. That threat could be diminished by forcefully evicting the Mormons from the state. Concerning the prudence of backing off the slavery issue during the Constitutional Convention, It's interesting to consider what Thomas Jefferson later said about the issue after trying and failing over the course of his lifetime to convince people to terminate the institution of slavery in our country. Near the end of his life, Jefferson justified his formal inaction as president regarding slavery in a letter to James Heaton in the following manner, quote, "A good cause is often injured more by the ill-timed efforts of its friends than by the arguments of its enemies. My sentiments, in other words, my moral opposition to the institution of slavery, have been 40 years before the public," end quote. David Barton wrote a book entitled The Jefferson Lies. In it, he chronicled the lies and myths about Jefferson that many have been led to believe. In it, he has a whole chapter on Jefferson's moral opposition to slavery. When he wrote the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson included the following statement in his list of grievances against the king. He, King George III, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people which never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. He has determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold," end quote. But at the insistence of South Carolina and Georgia, the statement was stricken from the final version. Consistent with that sentiment, Barton said that, quote, "In 1776, Jefferson wrote a draft of the original state constitution for Virginia and included a provision that, quote, 'no person hereafter coming into this country,' in other words, Virginia, "shall be held in slavery under any pretext whatsoever," end quote. That provision was rejected by the state constitution, end quote. In 1778, Jefferson introduced a bill in the Virginia legislature to ban the importation of slaves into Virginia from other countries. Concerning it, Jefferson said, quote, "This passed without opposition and stopped the increase of the evil by importation, leaving to future efforts its final eradication," end quote. Jefferson, as governor of Virginia in 1779, introduced a bill to, quote, "emancipate all slaves born after passing the act," end quote. It did not pass, but Jefferson remained convinced that, quote, "nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free," end quote. As is so often the case, some things take a lot of time to accomplish and must be approached incrementally to have any chance of ultimate success. A free people will change only when a majority of them feel the need for it. Jefferson said, quote, "We must await with patience the workings of an overruling providence, and hope that it is preparing the deliverance of these our suffering brethren. When the measure of their tears shall be full, when their groans shall have involved heaven itself in darkness, doubtless a God of justice will awaken to their distress," end quote. Elsewhere, Jefferson said, quote, "The whole commerce between master and slave is the most unremitting despotism on one part and degrading submission on the other, and with what execrations, or denunciations, should the statesman be loaded who permits one half the citizens thus to trample on the rights of the other? And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of a gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. The way, I hope, is preparing under the auspices of heaven for a total emancipation," end quote. In 1784, while a member of the Continental Congress, Jefferson introduced a bill to end slavery in every territory that would eventually become a state in the nation after 1800. It did not pass. With such bold statements about the immorality of slavery, it is extremely doubtful that Jefferson fathered any children through Sally Hemings, as some people believe. Barton also dedicates an entire chapter in his book refuting that allegation, including the supposed DNA evidence. Anyway, his foregoing quotes and actions clearly demonstrate Jefferson's moral aversion to the institution of slavery, but he saw that the country had not yet morally progressed to the point where it could voluntarily be eliminated. But if he felt so strongly that slavery was morally wrong, why didn't Jefferson free his slaves? Because under Virginia law, it was very difficult to financially do so. Under that law, the emancipator remained financially responsible for all of his slaves who were young, old, weak, or infirm. Jefferson was financially devastated when the large amount of money he loaned to the government during the Revolutionary War was effectively returned to him at a rate of about 2.5 cents on the dollar because of a major devaluation of the money. At one point, he had to sell his library to the federal government to get cash to run his household. As I recall, I believe he died heavily in debt. So quite frankly, under Virginia law, he couldn't financially afford to free his slaves. So he kept his slaves but tried to treat them well. According to Barton, unlike other slave owners, he paid his slaves, quote, for the vegetables they raised, meat obtained while hunting and fishing, and for extra tasks performed outside normal working hours. He even offered a revolutionary profit-sharing plan for the products that his enslaved artisans produced in their shops, end quote. As I was researching the issue of slavery, I came upon the foregoing information and thought you might be interested in it. Anyway, David Barton also wrote a book entitled Original Intent that did a great job of explaining the founding philosophy. I've liked everything I have ever seen him write or heard him say. If you ever see a book authored by him, I recommend you read it. In my opinion, he is a national treasure. That short coverage of slavery opens up the door to discussing the meaning of liberty. The title of my next lecture is The Origin and Meaning of Liberty.